1989 was a gruesome year for the land down under. A maniac let loose by circumstance, which I do not by any means think could have been quelled for long. A sleeping beast awakened with some of the most brutal attacks on ordinary people possibly ever recorded, and yet I feel most people in the world do not know about it. Or do they? In January 24th, 2005, one of the most successful box office horror films debuted by the name of Wolf Creek. This film from the Lucky Country is certainly one of my personal top 5 favorite horror films. Wish I could remember my number 1, but I cannot think of the name, and neither can anyone else apparently. If I get enough comments about this film though, I will make a video explaining the elusive underground film. Wolf Creek is an incredible film with an even more disturbing backstory. Most of my life I had no idea that Wolf Creek was based on these real events that took place from 1989 to 1992. But how close is the film to real life? That's what I wanted to dive into and reveal to you guys, while also respecting and telling the story of what happened to the victims. This is the tale of the backpacker murderer. Hey everyone, I wanted to try and make something a little bit more fun than usual. Usually all of my videos are pretty serious and pretty dark. This video is also going to be serious, but I didn't want it to be so serious that we couldn't have some Halloween fun. I know this is going to be a little bit of a weird topic, kind of comparing a movie to real life events, but I did also want to give respect to the victims and tell their story of their final moments. This is a brutal case involving a man by the name of Ivan Milat. He was born on December 27th, 1944, to a working-class family in a very rural part of Australia. His parents would often argue, and he was also number 5 of 14 siblings. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of parental attention or love, and all of the kids had to compete to get it. One of Ivan's younger brothers, however, George, has had quite a bit to say about his brother's past. Remembering how their lives were growing up, he told an interviewer how his older brother was very wild towards him because he chose to stay out of trouble. Now, that statement being said, it seems to me that George was the only one, if not one of few, of the siblings that decided not to get into trouble, but we'll get more into that later on. Unfortunately, it does seem that the younger siblings would get bullied quite often by the older ones. And as the younger ones would grow, they too would become bullies and bully their younger siblings. So I don't know how far this went, but we are going to see later on in the story how crazy a lot of these siblings could be, and that it wasn't just Ivan. George did receive the worst of it from Ivan himself, according to George, that is. George ended up recalling one story where he told his brother that his tire was going flat, only for Ivan to start screaming at him. From that moment on, George had decided that he was never going to effectively communicate with Ivan again. Now, going back to their parents, it seems his dad was certainly a bully, standing on 2 of his sons' backs, beating them with wooden 2x4s. This incident was actually reported on by neighbors. Now, keep in mind, this would have taken place sometime between the 40s and the 50s. Back then, it was kind of unspoken that you did not criticize other parents for the way they were parenting. Now, the one thing that very well could have been the main trigger, or the first trigger for Ivan, happened at a very early age. Ivan's sister, Margaret, ended up dying in a car accident. Apparently, Ivan managed to run over to her, since the accident was only a block away from the family home, and held her in his arms, blood rushing out everywhere. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, she would succumb to these injuries, never regaining consciousness during that 2-week period. This apparently changed Ivan to the point where he was obsessed with his appearance, and he became an absolute control freak. He needed to look well-dressed, well-shaved, and even in such perfect control that he refused to have alcohol so he could never lose control. From his garden to his house, everything had to be immaculate. This level of obsessiveness over control was clearly a very unhealthy way to cope for the death of his sister. Now, Ivan's old boss, Peter Cantarella, who ran a fruit shop, ended up talking a little bit about Ivan as well, saying that when he hired him as a teenager, he said Ivan worked for him for about 12 months and was an incredibly good worker. Then he would ask Peter for a loan to buy a car. He agreed because Ivan was such a good kid, but then immediately Ivan stopped showing up to work, and then he barely saw him outside of work, just in town in general. Peter was furious, and he made it a point to Ivan as to how furious he was. was about getting stiffed with that loan. However, this would set off a terrible chain reaction, as most of Ivan's siblings would end up showing up throwing rocks and sticks damaging his property. They would then later on break into Peter's shop and steal all of his guns and his wife's jewelry. Later on, Peter would then find himself in a spot where he would have to fist fight Ivan's older brother Bill and Ivan, to which Peter won pretty easily. These were his first known crimes: breaking into a shop, stealing those guns and jewelry, as well as getting into that fist fight. But this would continue into a pattern of him stealing cars all the way up to breaking into a military barrack and stealing a safe. That's crazy. Fortunately, he was a terrible criminal and almost got caught every single time he committed a crime. Therefore, he spent most of the 60s in jail. Now, Ivan would go from this to sexual assault for the first time when he picked up 2 female hitchhikers that were on their way to Melbourne. Somehow they confused him for a good amount of time before striking a deal with him that if one of them ended up getting romantic with him, he would let them live. Luckily, he was caught and charged, but unfortunately, he was acquitted due to the girls changing their testimony. I'm not sure how this happened. I'm not sure what attorney they may have had. This was 1977, so who really knows? Now, these girls would almost be the last known survivors of Ivan Milat. However, we'll get to that final survivor at the end of the video. Now, Ivan would meet his wife Karen in 1975. He was 30 years old and she was only 17. Karen was 6 weeks pregnant with another man's child, but chose to stay with Ivan so that she would have a stable man in her life. She would deeply regret this decision though. Ivan was a very jealous man. He would never let Karen leave the house, and he demanded receipts every time she went to the grocery store, and he would beat her mercilessly. She left him in 1987. However, Ivan would get revenge by burning down the front of her parents' home. July 13th, 1989, Ivan would officially be divorced, and only 6 months later, he committed his first murder. 2 backpackers went missing. Divorce was clearly the final trigger pull into making Ivan a full-fledged serial killer. If I had to guess, this was the second time he ever completely lost control, and that was more than enough to make sure that he would never lose control again. Now that we have his backstory, I would like to compare some of the things that the movie showed versus what actually took place, while also giving recognition to the horrific things he did to those poor people. Wolf Creek is a 2005 box office hit directed and written by Greg McLean. It was produced by David Lightfoot and starred by John Jarrett, Nathan Phillips, Cassandra Magrath, and Kesty Marassi. I think I said those names right, I'm sorry if I didn't. Its budget was roughly $1 million American dollars, but grossed nearly $30 million American dollars at the box office. Needless to say, that was quite the successful movie, and honestly one of my favorite films. As we all know, these movies usually say based on a true story, but are they really? Let's look at the conclusion to Ivan's story and see where the movie goes afterwards. I could go in order as to which victims were found first, but I found it to be better to go in the order of the crime he committed, seeing that almost every one of the bodies except for one was found in 1993, the other one being found in 1992. December 30th, 1989, Ivan would claim his first set of victims. Remember, this was just 6 months after his divorce. Ivan would prey upon James Gibson and Deborah Everest. The 2 local Australians that were visiting Sydney were last seen alive leaving Surrey Hills to hitchhike 300 miles to Albury. In October 1993, a local man searching for firewood discovered bones in a remote section of the forest. He returned with police to the scene where 2 bodies were discovered. It didn't take long for authorities to identify Gibson and Everest. Gibson's skeleton was found in the fetal position, showing 8 stab wounds. A large knife cut through the upper spine, causing paralysis. Remember this for later on, guys. And stab wounds to his back and chest would have punctured his heart and lungs. More on this disturbing torture later, though. Everest had been savagely beaten. Her skull was fractured in 2 places. Her jaw was broken and there were knife marks on her forehead. She had been stabbed once in the back. The presence of their bodies in Belanglo actually confused investigators, as Gibson's camera had previously been discovered on the 31st of December, 1989, and his backpack on March 13th, 1990, by the side of the road at Galston Gorge, in the northern Sydney suburbs, over 120 kilometers away, or in real units, 75 miles. It's a joke, by the way. Now, I didn't see anything in the movie specifically including Everest other than just the pure violence. However, I do have a reason at the end of the video that can explain why. In January of 1991, German backpacker Simone Schmidl, I think I said that name right as well, hopefully, left Sydney to meet her mother in Melbourne. This was the last time she was seen alive. And unfortunately, on November 1st, 1993, a skeleton was found in a clearing along a fire trail in the forest during a police sweep. It was identified to be Schmidl and bore at least 8 stab wounds. 2 of them had severed her spine, and others would have punctured her heart and lungs. Are you starting to see a pattern? It does seem that Ivan favored this type of horrendous torture, and it was something that was done in the movie as well. As I recall, the killer, whose name in the movie is Mick Taylor, paralyzed and toyed with his victims, calling this terrible technique a head on a stick. Clothing found at the scene was not Schmidl's, but matched that of another missing backpacker, Habshid. His 4th and 5th victims, December 20th, 1991, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habshid, 2 German hitchhikers who were last seen alive leaving King's Cross hitchhiking to Darwin. The bodies of Habshid and Neugebauer were then found on a nearby fire trail, not far from Schmidl on November 4th, 1993, in shallow graves only 50 meters or 160 feet apart. Habshid had been decapitated, and shockingly her skull was never found. Neugebauer, which I must say is online how they pronounced it. I listened to a video on how to pronounce that name. Don't give me crap for that. You can give me crap for that, but don't do it. Had been shot in the head 6 times. There was evidence that some of the victims did not die instantly from their injuries. Sorry guys, I just kind of had to throw that in there. I could not figure out how to pronounce that name and it was really difficult. Normally I wouldn't even try, but I put some effort in there and I hope that doesn't backfire on me in some weird way. I don't know, I'm not trying to be mean. I promise, I'm not trying to be mean about their name. It's just, I can't figure out how to pronounce it properly, but I gave it a shot. I do have a feeling the movie was directly basing its characters off of these 3 specific victims. The movie had 3 victims hiking together, and all 3 of them went through similar circumstances to a degree. However, the movie, of course, had its victims be able to fight back, and this appears to not have even been possible for the actual victims, as well as some getting their fingers cut off or fed to dogs. One of the people managed to escape, and we'll get into him a little bit later on. However, I do believe that this is pretty much all of the similarities to this film. The last 2 victims Ivan had were the very first ones to be found. April 18th, 1992, British backpackers Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark, last seen alive leaving King's Cross to hitchhike around Australia. And all victims were last seen around the Hume Highway, I should mention. On September 19th, 1992, 2 runners discovered a corpse while orienteering, which I had to look up as a group of sports that involve using a map and compass to navigate from point to point in diverse and usually unfamiliar terrain in a type of like race, which I guess took place in the Bellingo forest at that time actually. So kind of wild that he chose that forest, a very active forest, to be committing these crimes in. The following morning, police discovered a second body 30 meters or 100 feet from the first corpse. Police confirmed via dental records that these bodies had belonged to Clark and Walters. Walters had been stabbed 15 times, 4 times in the chest, once in the neck, and 9 times in the back, which would have paralyzed her. Again, using this favorite technique of torture. Clark had been shot over 10 times in the head at the burial site, and police believed she had been used as target practice. I never did see anything involving this in Wolf Creek, so I do not believe that they used this, unless I just missed it. But this would have been so brutal, I'm not sure that they necessarily could have done something like this in a film. So you can understand why the film will never quite be as horrifying as what real life has to offer. Which I guess, in that sense, is probably what makes us enjoy horror films. After a thorough search of the forest, investigators ruled out the possibility of further discoveries within Bellinglow. Now, my deepest condolences to the victims and their families for what this sick person did. This is a perfect example of how real life can be way more brutal than the movies that set out to specifically freak us out. That being said, there are really not too many similarities. There was no sign of poisoned water to easily kidnap the victims. There was no evidence he had a shack in which he carried out his deeds. Nor is there anything involving him allowing dogs to eat people alive. Now we're gonna get back to the final survivor. If you remember that at the beginning of this video. Paul Onions is his name. This did not happen in the film either. Paul Onions was picked up, and when Ivan was starting to take him away, he realized what was going on and fought back. He scrambled out of the truck when Ivan, who was actually calling himself Bill at the time, ended up pulling a gun on him and saying, "If you run away, I'll shoot." But seeing how close they were to traffic, Paul went ahead and ran directly into traffic, causing an uproar, causing cars to swerve, and Ivan took off, not wanting to cause a scene or be a part of the scene, allowing Paul to live. Of course, that wasn't exactly in the film. Instead, the guy who was tied up to a wall with dogs getting closer and closer to him ended up, he managed to slip out of it somehow and take off running. And he was the sole survivor of the movie, I think as an homage to Paul Onions, but it didn't quite happen that way. So all in all, this movie was very loosely based in reality. However, I still think it is one of the more horrifying movies and well put together movies out there when it comes to the horror genre. I absolutely adore the movie quite a bit, even though it has quite a dark past behind it. That being said, again, I wish the best for the families. It happened in 1992, so I'm certain, since that was the year I was born, a lot of these families are around, and I don't want to affect them negatively. However, there is the fact that there is a multi-million-dollar film about this event that is all over the place, and I just wanted to go ahead and compare the two and see how close is it based in real life. We found out it's not that close. However, they did include the techniques, which I think is about as far as you really could go to making a real life event without completely disrespecting them. However, I don't know how the families feel about Wolf Creek. I've never seen any interviews about it. I've never seen anyone from that family talk about it. I did try looking some stuff up, and of course, I just get Wolf Creek advertisements, so maybe somebody can do a little bit better digging than me, or maybe I just didn't dig good enough, but I did try to find something on that. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy Halloween to everybody. I hope this video came across as intended and showed no disrespect. I just thought this could be a very interesting topic. If you did enjoy this though, please leave a like, subscribe, and share, and thank you all so much for spending your Halloween with me. And please remember to stay safe, be aware, and protect yourselves. This level of obsessed... Man. Ugh, sparkling water. Can't say the name because they should sponsor me because I like them a lot, but they should pay me. No, it's Liquid Death. That stuff's amazing. Anyway, and it's helped me lose this big old belly. Okay, where was I? Now that we have his backstory, man, I need water. The presence of Gibson's